Now joining us, ESPN college football analyst. He's a regular on Mondays. He is Trevor Matich on the Deseret First Credit Union hotline. Trevor, where do we even begin with BYU and Michigan, in your opinion?
We don't. There's very little you can learn from that game. There's some things, but the nature of the start of the season and the way that BYU had really left it all on the field after the first three games and what happened at Michigan, you can't really, for the most part, judge the team, its talent, its preparation based on that game. It was just a perfect storm, and it blew BYU up onto the rocks. And there are a few lessons to learn, but mostly it's a matter of coming out and finding a way to get their bodies recharged and restart the season.
Trevor, if you're a coach and you're analyzing the film, and like you said, there's really nothing you can learn from or any takeaways from this game, do you just come in on Monday and just throw that film out and say, hey, we're flipping the page and we're going to focus on UConn this Friday?
I think you throw most of the film out. I think there's two things you look at, Brian. One is the receivers. The receivers needed to carry this team in a game like this. They were the one place where there was a physical advantage. Even though Michigan has pretty big physical defensive backs, BYU was bigger. They needed to be more physical because they were being covered in man coverage and challenged to beat that man coverage, and they did not do it. The receivers need to watch that tape in fine detail because every defensive backfield that they play from here till eternity is going to do what Michigan did to them until they prove that they can beat that physical man coverage. So the receivers need to watch this tape. Then the defense really needs to watch the first half especially because they tended to over-pursue. Michigan would start one direction, come back the other direction, and BYU defenders' legs were too tired to really stop and explode back the other way if they weren't in perfect position to start with. That was one of the reasons they got gashed so many times in the first half. So the defense could stand to look at some individual plays in the first half just to make sure they understand how to maintain those lanes on the backside. And other than that, I would throw the rest of the tape away because other than that, I don't see a single thing that they can learn from it.
Trevor, you've mentioned a couple of times now kind of fatigue and bodies and that kind of thing. Did BYU get worn out after the first 3 weeks? I mean, you go on the road for two, then a third game on the road. Is there something to that?
Well, I think there are two people that believe that. Certainly, I believe that, and UCLA quarterback Josh Rosen believes that. He said that after the game last week, but it makes sense. Because you look at the schedule they played, Nebraska, at Nebraska, Boise, at UCLA, at Michigan. The quality of those teams are very much like playing the meat of an SEC schedule. And I'm not saying that those four teams are top SEC caliber teams, but then again, Michigan was brutally tough on the lines of scrimmage. UCLA, same way. Boise State, terrific at the line. Nebraska has a lot of big guys. And so you see BYU playing what amounts to the meat of a Power 5 conference schedule at the highest level without having the advantage of recruiting to a Power 5 team from a standpoint of depth. So SEC teams tend to have greater depth along the line because they've been there for a while, and so they get those kinds of recruits. Utah, it took them a few years to develop the kind of depth that they needed to compete year in and year out through a Pac-12 schedule. And now BYU in September has that kind of a schedule without the advantage of being able to recruit to it. So I think they were magnificent in those first three games. But I do believe that this Michigan game has a lot to do with the fact that they just got tired, and I do not blame them for that. The reason they were tired was because of the amazing effort they put in during the month of September.
Trevor, with that being said, is this type of scheduling too much for BYU and this football program moving forward?
It's not if they're able to win. See, in this game against Michigan, if they'd have been competitive somehow, it would just be awesome. Unfortunately, they weren't, and it was quite the opposite. But I think they could still manage this kind of schedule. It's just hard to play these kinds of teams all in a row. If they were spread out more instead of playing these four in a row, then you'd see a different situation with BYU. It's one of the reasons that in the SEC, the week before the big rivalry games at the end of the season, Alabama and Auburn and Georgia and all those teams play an FCS school. before that rivalry game so that they can recharge. BYU didn't have the opportunity to recharge here. So it's not a matter of not being able to compete with these teams. They can. It's a matter of figuring out a way to schedule them so that they're not all in a row, 4 in a row. The problem there is that those teams can only play, most of them, these kinds of games with BYU early in the season because then they get into their own conference schedules. It's just another reason why BYU, if they can get into a Power 5 conference, would have, advantages in terms of that kind of scheduling.
Yeah, and then you're looking at that kind of schedule even tougher. And I think the concern there, Trevor, is that next year is an even tougher schedule for BYU. You play Arizona neutral, but in Arizona, at Utah, UCLA at home, West Virginia neutral at FedEx Field there. So that's tough. And then you play Toledo at Michigan State, Mississippi State at Boise State. So if you think 2015 stuff, 2016 stuff, and the other thing that's maybe underrated besides fatigue, Trevor, and we're still waiting to hear about certain injuries from BYU, is the injury factor. You play tough teams, you might get hurt. There were some guys, 5 notable guys, starters, that left the game. Is this something that maybe BYU has to pull off the pedal just a touch in the future?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I like the idea that they want to schedule these games because they will be competitive in most of these things. And being competitive, playing exciting football, these games draw eyeballs of recruits. And they can see that they can go to BYU and help put BYU over the top. And I think it's important for what BYU wants to do because BYU needs to recruit nationally in order to get to where they want to go. And these kinds of games get BYU physically on the road in front of those recruits and gets them on TV in a game that's of great interest to those recruits. And I think those things are important. I don't blame necessarily the scheduling concept for this. This was just a perfect storm where it just all fell apart. Now, I will say this, that you learn. And maybe next year they change the way they practice. Maybe next year, instead of working on tackling in heavy physical practices the week before a game like this, which they did, for this week, they will back it off and say, look, our tackling wasn't good last week, but we'd rather be rested and take our chances with tackling. And so you learn things like that with this kind of a schedule.
Trevor, so after you had the opportunity to really evaluate this BYU football team for a month, where would you put the win expectation now coming off of a loss like Michigan?
Well, the most they can win now in the regular season is 10 games. And I think that they could get to, since they've already got 2, I think they would lose 1, maybe 2 more. I think a 9-win season would be outstanding. A 10-win season would be phenomenal. And they still have some very sneaky tough games coming up. UConn took Missouri to the wire. East Carolina just beat Virginia Tech. Missouri is the 2-time defending SEC East champion, and of course we all know that Utah State game is always a problematic game. So if BYU can turn a 2-2 start into a 9-3 season, that would be they should get a ton of credit for that. Keep this in mind too, that as much as it feels horrible after this Michigan week, and it does feel horrible, coming out of this schedule, if we would have said, okay, we're going to be 2-2 in September, what do you think? How many people would have said, that'd be all right. We'd be all right on that schedule.
I called for 2 in the summer. I said 2 would be good.
Yeah, 2-2. The problem is that it feels so bad now because of the nature of this second loss.
Sure. ESPN's Trevor Matich is on BYU Sports Nation. Now BYU looks at Connecticut. You mentioned it. Certainly a team that played a tough game at Missouri. Probably should have at least tied that game. They were down 3, had a field goal, went for a fake field goal despite 3 guys standing in the end zone. Anyway, Connecticut top 25 defense. But for BYU, what do you want improved the most by BYU Friday versus Connecticut? What do you want to see?
I want to see those big receivers play like big receivers. This is something we talked about last week heading into the UCLA game, that those guys are really not the bell cows, but they're the advantage. They're the matchup advantage that BYU has now that Taysom Hill and Jamal Williams both are not there. They need to play like big receivers. They need to fight through the press coverage. They need to fight with their hands through the defensive back's hands and arms to fight into where the ball is when the defensive back has the advantage. They need to come back for that ball and fight for it. I mean, fight for it. I don't mean like, oh, well, let's see if we can make the catch. I mean, fight for it in a hateful fashion. Hateful, meaning if the defensive back is going for that football and it looks like he's going to get it, you have to hate it that guy might beat you to that ball. It's one thing to like catching the ball. It's another thing entirely to hate losing out on that catch. And they need to play with that kind of hatefulness. And I haven't seen that from them yet as a group. They need to do that because they still have that advantage going forward. But they can't just sort of play the game. They've got to get into it. And keep in mind that when I use the word hateful, I'm referring to that as a style of play. And so people that are spraining their little thumb hamstrings on Twitter right now saying that we need to hate people, no, that's not what it is. It's that ball's coming in, and somebody else looks like they might get it, not you. You need to hate the concept that you will lose out on that ball. And if you want to pick a different word, pick a different word. My thesaurus is kind of thin today.
Well, thumb strings is a real thing. We just discovered that. Trevor, great insight. We appreciate it every Monday. Have a great week, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks, guys.